Thank you. So thanks everyone for coming back after lunch and being willing to listen to another session. I wanted to start off today by talking about something relatively positive. A year ago, I stood up here and gave the keynote at this event, and most of you, if any of you were here, and these guys that are laughing down here were, I left everybody with the impression that if we didn't do something right now, Drupal was just going to go somewhere we didn't want it to. I'm happy to report a year later that it's going somewhere we do want it to, and that's kind of transforming government. So things are going well in government, and I want to talk to you a little bit today about kind of how government is using Drupal, what the different use cases are, what the different scenarios, what we've seen implemented at the federal level in particular in Drupal. So Drupal's growing in government. We're seeing wide-scale adoption right now. When the White House flipped in 2009, it caused a little bit of I think a signaling reaction for other agencies that not only was open source okay, but that a great way to do open source would be to do Drupal. And so I think what that created is essentially this kind of open invitation to agencies that were looking for another way to do websites to go and pick up Drupal. And a few of the names that are up here are the folks that are actually either implementing Drupal right now or have implemented Drupal in the past, and that list is very, very large and growing. I would invite all of you, actually, as a great resource, to look on Drupal.org. There is a complete list. If you just Google Drupal in government, you'll find a complete, extensive list of all the sort of U.S. examples as well as international examples, and I think you'll definitely agree. It's pretty impressive. So why is government going to Drupal? What are the top reasons that we hear when we talk to people who are in the public sector? First, I think everybody agrees that being an open source technology, there's fairly low barriers to entry. You don't have to go work with a sales rep to get a demo or get an installation or a trial or anything like that. You just go to Drupal.org and you download a distribution, or you download Drupal itself, and you play with themes, you play with modules, and you get started. And that's a really empowering thing for people who have been in proprietary systems, custom systems, and things like that for a long time. It also provides a real demonstrable return on investment. Being open source is a way to say, for people who are dealing with shrinking budgets, they're able to say, look, we're saving the taxpayer money by going to open source. Sure, there's costs for implementation, there's costs for maintenance and things like that, but right now we can cut the bottom line on the licensing fees and things like that we're paying. There's no vendor lock-in. A lot of agencies, in government in particular, you're dealing with scenarios where large procurement processes have created long-term, sort of almost cartel-like holdings on government contracts. And that kind of thing is not good for the taxpayer. It's also very onerous for the people that have to deal with those contracts. Over a long period of time, I think governments are looking at Drupal and open source as a way to really save on total cost of ownership. So they're thinking about the innovation that the community is going to be doing for them, the modules that they're going to be able to use, and the development that they're not going to have to do by going open source. Why developers love it, why all of us use it, is flexibility. It has true technical flexibility. We can add modules, we can add functionality, we can change the theme layer, we can do API integration, we can do all kinds of wonderful things with it. And my personal favorite is the reason that we're all here today, which is this community innovation and contribution. You know, most of you are probably here because you either contribute to this community or you're interested at this point in what you're going to get out of it. And I think the main thing you're going to get out of it is other people doing software for you. How cool is that, right? I mean, how cool is it to think that people are just going to write software for free for you? And you're not even going to have to think about what that is. You know, if there's some new thing coming along that's the next Twitter, you don't have to go write a module for it. Chances are within a week or two, someone will have done it. And it's probably going to be crappy at first, but after a couple weeks, couple months, you'll have a pretty good piece of working code that's been tested by literally tens or hundreds of thousands of people around the world. And that's done for you for free, and you install it. How cool is that? And then, the last thing is you don't have to deal with this sort of complex architecture that is hard to extend. Once you have your Drupal site, if you want to 6 months or a year later, you want to add a new piece of functionality, you can do that. It's built from the ground up to do that. And think about how quickly things change in the public sector, how you're reaching out to new citizen services and things like that, and how important that could be. So the key things I want to focus on today, specifically for public sector, there's basically 6 trends, I would say, that we're sort of seeing in what's changing. One is usability. I'm going to show you a great example of usability in public sector. 2 is visualizations, how to actually take data and make something interesting for the citizen with that public data. 3 is what I call platform building, and that takes a little bit more explaining, but it's basically the idea that with Drupal you can build an entire platform of sites. You're not dealing with just building individual websites. You're actually building a framework, an entire structure you could roll out for your whole state government, for your whole agency, for someone like the Department of Homeland Security, who's got 635 websites. Do you think they want to build each one of those individually? Do you think they don't want those to have common components, common modules, a single way to maintain it, to change that code base? Collaboration. So the idea that either citizen to citizen or agency to agency, that you're actually getting some interactive functionality, so-called Web 2.0. We're talking about, in federal government, we're talking about reaching out to citizens and creating a dialogue with them. Reuse. So, if the city of Memphis developed something that the city of Atlanta could also use, why don't we have a method where they do that? Why would both cities go out and procure the same piece of functionality from different vendors and pay for it? There should be reuse. That's what open source can really provide for us. And then the last is engagement. The idea that an individual can actually have a dialogue directly with their government via the web. So I want to show you an example of a website that launched on Drupal this year. It's the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and they built this site that I think is a beautiful website. It's fcc.gov. It's a beautiful site. It's easy to navigate. It's easy to figure out what they do, where to find things. And the guy in charge of this is now our federal CIO. And so the guy who has Vivek Kundra's job is a guy who just got done implementing Drupal over the last 9 months. So I think that tells you a lot about maybe where the opportunities are going on this as well. But if you really look at this, let's look at sort of there's a previous site link. And they did this really to make the point that they really had one of the crappiest websites in all of government. I mean, it was so damn ugly. And I mean, it's just a link farm, right? I mean, it looks like a spammer got on there or something. Let's highlight like a specific example up here. It's like, just a bunch of links, and here you're kind of your leaders, your commissioners or whatever, and look at how they did it in the new one. There's this persona, this idea, and if you click through, you get individual personal profiles about these people. And that's about open government is about actually understanding who's in charge of doing specific things within an agency for you, because you're a taxpayer, and these people work for you. This is another great example. Like before, you just couldn't find anything on there. It was a link farm, right? And this is a fairly simple way to do in Drupal. We've got the ability to sort and categorize by taxonomy, topics, categories, things like that, document types. And you put that together in a nice searchable interface. It makes for an entirely different experience for the user. So what are the takeaways from a site like this? User interface matters. It matters a lot in government. The average citizen, I don't mind telling you, is not web savvy. They probably don't really know how to get around most of these websites and find the stuff they need. So user experience really matters a lot. The second thing is, FCC did a great job of making their product known and understood. Most people don't probably know what the FCC does. They did a really good job of bringing forward the services that they actually have for citizens. And then, this idea that choosing something like Drupal actually has an impact on how your brand as an agency is portrayed. So that's a great segue to the next example I have, which is the Department of Energy, energy.gov. probably the most recent one to get converted. Great examples of visualization here. I mean, it's also a beautiful design, but you know, the things I kind of want to focus on here are just slightly different. You know, let's kind of talk about what was challenging. Well, you know, on the old site, you've got basically, here's an example of data that was on the old site, and it's fuel economy data, right? Something that I think a lot of people are interested in and probably didn't know was out there. And look at how they did it. It's just like, it's a PDF, which is not open data. You can't parse it. You can't do anything with it. Or it's a data file. And those data files are just these obscure links again. So look at, this is a new example. So this right here is an entirely, I mean, think about the transition from looking at the information that way to looking at it this way. Well, what they've done is they've made a browsable, interactive, attractive, useful map, and they've used open source technology to do it. So this is built upon sort of MapQuest and OpenStreetMap data. It's all publicly available data. And then they use a tool called Mapbox, which was developed by a company in the Drupal community called Development Seed. And they did it to make it interact with the site in terms of its design and its style. They can change the tiles and all that. But a lot of this is just underlying Drupal functionality. It's the ability to integrate these things very easily. And the company that did this is actually represented here today. It's Treehouse. They did a great job, and you know, the fact that they took a bunch of different open source tools and put them together is again a testament to sort of what you can do with open source to help government. Another, you know, and by the way, it's a really cool design. It doesn't look like a government website at all, which was sort of the key thing. But it also kind of it hits the user like at their pain point. So what a lot of us probably think of with the Department of Energy now is about fuel consumption and basically, you know, how we're going to do alternative fuels and how we're going to deal with, like, you know, powering our electric cars and things like that. And this website really kind of speaks to us. It educates us on these matters. It engages us directly as individuals. I mean, you know, this rotator is kind of featuring individual people and their stories, which is kind of cool. You know, and also it makes the data useful and engaging. So you're not dealing with like a bunch of links and a bunch of sort of boring tabs and things like that. They're actually bringing these things out and they're kind of drawing your attention to it. They're showing you, like, they're educating you about what's important about energy consumption. And that's a really important change from the way of just governments just putting data out there and just saying, blah, here's a whole bunch of information. I'm not going to work with you to try to figure out, you know, how you can see this information in a way that's useful for you. You're just throwing it out there. You know, they're engaging with social media. It's another good example. So, you know, let's look at like another, like, you know, in addition to just kind of having these visualizations, like here's another good example. So, you know, they've got this Mapbox template and they just use different tiles, but they use the same templates and the same formats and the same data structures to take this piece of information, which is basically like workforce training programs around smart grid technology. And that's got a certain, you know, way that they want to present it, these colorful dots and things like that. And of course you can browse in and out. And then you take the very same technology, it's the same, it's all the same underpinnings. What they do is they swap out essentially the tile and the data on top, and they overlay different information using the same thing. You don't have to go create some, you know, image map, some GIF image map 5 times or something like that. They're just changing data files. It's a really interactive, nice way to present information. And I actually understand this. I don't know anything about energy, but, you know, it's fairly clear to me if I follow the colored map, you know, what I'm learning about who's consuming the most energy in the U.S. And New Yorkers are clearly evil. So, you know, the takeaways for me are, you know, just because you're a government doesn't mean that you don't have to reach out to people and tell a story about why what you do for them is actually useful. Like, turn this into a storefront. Sell that individual citizen why they actually need to understand what it is that you do. And take that data that they paid for and make it useful to them. Don't just dump a file out there. Actually show visualizations. Show some interactivity to it. Show something that I can do something with in my life. So that's kind of an example of visualization. Platforms, I intentionally have less attractive pictures here, so it's not that there aren't actually attractive sites here. But, you know, the good example is the House of Representatives in January, well, actually, let me go back even further. In fall of last year, the House of Representatives web team was running, 600 or so when you deal with all the congressmen and then all the committees, different websites, all built in different technologies, and they were having problems standardizing and getting sort of, having security issues and things like that. And they decided to standardize on a platform. They picked Drupal, and they went and they essentially created a platform where you could roll out individual sites based on the same sort of underlying structures within Drupal, the same content types, the same features and things like that. And once they built that, when the new freshmen were elected and they found out that there was going to be, whatever it was, 90 or so freshmen coming in that landslide in November, they took this platform that had just been built and they built 100 Drupal 7 sites in 2 weeks for those 90-something congressmen. And on January 2nd, and that's all right around the holidays, and January 2nd, those people came in, and there was almost 100 new websites that were sitting there ready to go, that were fully functional, worked great, had all the features and functions that any congressman could need. The social media stuff, the photo gallery stuff, the video stuff, the citizen engagement stuff, and all that. And literally, these people just walked in and thought that that's just what they get when they join Congress. And in the past, it was nothing like that, nothing. And they couldn't have done that without Drupal and without the idea that you have this platform. So, the old way also contributed to significantly wasteful spending. They didn't have a standard way to give you functionality, so they had to do everything one-off. It was like just building website after website after website. And now they can stand a website up in a matter of hours. So that's a great example of kind of platform building. And again, the key there is standardizing, but not making it look like it's standard. So again, I don't know if these are the most visually attractive examples, but these websites can actually look entirely different. You can use theming and styles within Drupal to actually deliver a different sort of user experience every time, even with the same core set of functionality. And that doesn't take a programmer to change any of that. It's all done with HTML and CSS. So their designers could stand up a new site and make it look completely different without doing a line of code, which was really, really cool. So the takeaways for platform building, it's about efficiency. So not spending money building individual sites, but building upfront once a core platform and then being able to roll out individual sites. Standardization. So once they have a standard way of building these sites, the maintenance of those things becomes very cost effective. It's easy to make changes to one and make changes to all. Scalability. So another sort of side note that these things can get pretty heavy traffic too. You don't know, God only knows, you don't know what your congressmen are going to do tomorrow and it's going to get in the news, right? So we all seen those examples, and that's traffic hits those sites pretty fast. And extensibility. So if their new media team decides that they have some new thing that they want to be able to essentially put on the site to serve their constituents, it's really easy for them to go back and add a new feature or module to it, and that's really important for them. So that's kind of what I consider platform building. Next example is collaboration. So one of the really cool things about Drupal is that it was designed from the ground up with this idea that an individual is a kind of a profile, is an entity in the system that can be sort of put into a social arrangement with other people. So think of social networking, Facebook or something like that. Well, that kind of functionality is built into Drupal from the start. So to use it as a collaboration platform makes a lot of sense. This is an example that not a lot of people have seen, and these are just actually sort of obscured content things. But within the White House, they actually have an intranet that we helped stand up very quickly on Drupal internally, and it basically runs two things. Before, they had no searchability, they had no internal collaboration tools on their intranet, and they had very poor asset management, like attaching files and things like that. So you go there, it's like just like the home page is this HTML page that's got, I don't know, the weather widget flickering there in the corner, and then what they're serving in the in the galley that day, in the kitchen. It's like, it was this terrible thing, and you couldn't find, how do I get a security clearance? How do I, How do I onboard a new employee? How do I open a requisition? How do I get out of the building if there's a terrorist alert? So so what was done is it was basically redesigned using Drupal. It's actually a beautiful intranet and one of the better looking ones I've seen. It's done basically by organizing all these assets using taxonomy in Drupal and then strapping a very powerful Solr search to it so that you can do faceted searching. And it makes all that stuff very discoverable. So like, here's an example, like the tools for collaborators up on the right-hand side are like, where all my forms are, but like there's a browsable phone book, there's a searchable directory, and all types of things like that. Another good example is like, if you look at like kind of, just using taxonomy, how you can take the most common processes that anyone does, and you just tag these things that are most common, and then they appear in this front sort of browser in the front. All the forms, same thing. And then, being able to persist favorites. So an individual has a user profile, so then we know what things they look at the most or use the most, and then we start to bring those up to the front page. And that's sort of a nice way to come back to the things you always want. And these aren't, super complex intranet functions, not something that people don't do all the time. But what's interesting is in Drupal, you do that in a matter of a couple weeks, and it's beautiful, and it works great, and it's easy to maintain. Whereas they spent, years custom coding like these intranet pages that didn't have any of this functionality. So it's about flexibility, and it's about, again, having that framework that they themselves can modify and extend. A side note on this, and I didn't do screenshots, but there's also, if you're familiar with Open Atrium, there's an Atrium collaboration area off of this. So you have your intranet, and then you basically, if you want to spin off a project discussion where you're working on an individual thing, you can go off and have an Atrium group just to talk about that and share documents. So that's sort of the collaborative element that I just don't have pictures of at the moment. Another example from the White House. So as we mentioned, the White House has essentially, running Drupal, has been running Drupal for 2 years now. But what's really cool is what they've been adding on top of it. So a couple weeks ago, you may have noticed they came out with something they call We the People. This is absolutely the most advanced open government initiative done on the web ever. It's essentially an open invitation to every U.S. citizen to just create, sign, and vote on petitions that the White House is actually looking at in real time every day. And it's really, really cool. So, what could possibly go wrong? Fact is, there's a lot of wackos out there. Shocker. So, this is called We the People, and it's on the White House site now. And what's really cool is that on top of Drupal is a very flexible sort of JavaScript, very performant system of creating and managing these petitions. That's a very light, very sort of cool UI feel to it. But it's all built on top of Drupal. So examples are like, people are going to come in and create a petition. Other people are going to come in and they're going to tweet that out to their friends. People are going to come in and sign those petitions, and these things sort of get bubbled up. And the fairly significantly high-ranking people in the West Wing are actually reviewing these, looking at them, and getting a pulse real time what the American people are actually interested in. Which turns out, incidentally, to be largely about UFOs, marijuana, and like PETA. So, but there are legitimately, important opinions through all these things. So, another great example would just be kind of, thinking a lot about. Sorry, let's get to my takeaways on this one. People ask, is Drupal scalable? Well, the traffic on this thing is outrageous. So, it's a good example of using other technologies on top of the Drupal interface to actually deliver and render pages a little bit more performant for high traffic and high load examples. It's also a great example of just the ability to have engagement tools that are still secure and accessible and scale. So, talk about like massive engagement. It's hey, I'm the President of the United States, what do you think? Put it on the web. And that's pretty cool. So another great example of sort of things that we think are really groundbreaking in this would be, again, I said before, the idea that this all empowers reuse, right? So one of the key things in government is, why do we have to do things over and over again? And the answer is we don't. It's just that there's procurement systems and vendors and implementation methodologies that have driven us to the idea that if you're in government and you need something to serve citizens, you have to go out through some lengthy process and procure it yourself. And it's probably going to be custom built or something like that. And actually with open source, you have the opportunity to turn that on its head. So my example here, and I apologize if this one's a little bit harder to read because it's kind of done in pastels and things, but the Department of Education used Drupal to build, and in Open Atrium specifically, to build an ideation tool. An ideation is basically similar to kind of what we were talking about before. It's tell me what you think we need to be doing. What are the best ideas to solve this problem? And then those get ranked and they get voted and they get voted up. So it's crowdsourcing of the best ideas within government, and those are all kind of done in this interactive way. Drupal was, again, perfectly matched for this because you had the profile system, even these widgets along here, these sort of ranking things. It's a standard module. It's a 5-star module, just restyled to be done in kind of cooler little widgets and things like that. But this is all reusable code from the start. Then what's really cool is we actually took that in that module and we made an app for it in our open public distribution, which is the distribution that we've been developing for government to do these things. And now you can actually take that same piece of functionality that they developed and paid for, and you can drop it into any other Drupal 7 site that you have, and it just works the way it is, kind of like installing an app on your iPhone. It's really cool, and we've actually gone through this example. We've had people install this ideation application in other places. And there's some other examples of things we've done like that. But, again, like what's really cool, I think, about the ideation concept is that, innovation is really the ability to either through some web technology or whatever. In this case, you're getting real innovation because you're actually getting people to put their ideas out there and then vote them up, vote them down in a very collaborative way that's natural for Drupal. It's also a great example of reuse because that functionality, A, came from modules that the Drupal community created, but then B, we're able to take that functionality that they paid money for and had developed and then move it out there into the public domain so that other people can install it. So if you're another agency and you want to be able to do the same thing that the Department of Education did, you should be able to just grab that rather than go through some lengthy procurement process. And you can do that, and that's what Drupal.org enables. So that's my example of reuse. So, kind of coming back to the big picture here, there's lots of ways that open source helps government. And what we're trying to do in the community with Drupal, and open public specifically, but a lot of people that are doing government stuff in Drupal, is we're trying to figure out what those key things are that all public sector organizations need. And I think these are only 6 of many. I think there's probably a lot more details around citizen engagement, specific services you can provide. At the state level, it's it's your driver's license and things like that, and packaging all this stuff up to be able to redeliver it to people. So you heard it mentioned earlier, and you may have seen it in the news, but the entire state of Georgia. I shouldn't say this. The GTA, the Georgia Technology Authority, many of whom are represented here today, have selected Drupal as a platform that they would use to rebuild many of the sites that, Georgia.gov and many of the other state sites. What's interesting is how much of this experience can they leverage because it's open source, and how little of it would they be able to leverage if it was proprietary and done as custom one-off implementations. It's a very profound question when you think about the implications on sort of the economy, the economy and what we're going through, and you think about the ability to leverage those things that have already been paid for in the public domain. There we go. So, sort of for me, the collective experience of this is that, for the most part, a lot of good use cases, a lot of good examples, a lot of good code, a lot of good ideas are out there in the public domain already. And those things are things that we've talked about, but this is growing like very, very, very quickly, faster than anyone could keep pace on. And so what you're going to see over, I think, the next 6 months to a year is just a huge explosion of different implementation in government. And I, for one, am very excited about it. I think as a citizen, it makes a lot of sense. I think as an IT person, it makes a lot of sense. And as an open source person, I'm glad that they're turning to our community to do it. So that's all I have. Thank you. Yeah, I could, it's early, so I could take a few questions if people have questions. Which they don't. Doug?
Same question I had for Karen earlier. What objections are you still hearing from some government people?
Oh, good question. So the question is, what objections are we still hearing from government in adopting open source or Drupal specifically? Or yeah, the same things I think we've heard for a while. One of the concerns tends to be security. I think that's kind of a myth-busting scenario. I mean, a lot of the concern over security is that this is out in the public domain. Most people who are credible around the discussion of security in open source understand that by being out there, it gives you the ability to actually put a lot more eyes on it, look for a lot more vulnerabilities. It's a lot harder to hide things that are insecure when they're out there in the public domain for anyone to look at, test, and review. So I think that's an education process. I think it's a comfort level thing. Certainly security is of paramount importance to government, so I understand that they want to take that slowly. The other concern I think is surrounds support. The idea that if you're working with if you're working with any technology, you have SharePoint. You've paid a lot of money for licensing, but then you can call your Microsoft rep down and strangle them if you need to. And I think there's a little bit of concern in the open source community. We don't have that same thing, and that's a role that Acquia certainly is playing. That's sort of think of Red Hat and Linux. They want if you're an IT department that's accustomed to and has the ability to procure support contract where you've got an 800 number to call and things like that. Maybe you need Acquia to be comfortable with Drupal. Maybe without that it isn't good for you, or maybe you just really get involved in the community. You come to these things and you get on IRC and you get on Drupal.org and you train your own people so that you actually understand how to fix things and when security patches come out and things like that. But for the most part, I think it's an education thing, and it's changing fairly rapidly. So. So the question is when you create a module or you create a piece of functionality in Drupal and then you're moving it somewhere else, do you have to go through security scanning and testing again? Correct. The answer is typically yes. I mean, if you're dealing with if you depends on what sort of what kind of certification you have to go through and what kind of government bodies you're trying to please at the time. But for the most part, in the federal government. If you're going to go through the FSMA process, then you are going to have to review code again, whether it's been contributed or not. But the nice thing is, and what we've learned is, if you have dedicated security teams, either as contractors or working for the government itself, whose job it is to do penetration testing, security scans, things like that. If you're using contributed modules and using Drupal core, you can actually point them to that stuff in advance, as long as you're not going to modify it, and they can actually start that process ahead of where you are in the development cycle. So you can say, oh, we're going to use open public version, blah, 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 and they go out there and they download it and they start banging and wailing away on it and doing whatever they do in the dark recesses of those rooms, and they do all that stuff in advance, and they're still going to want to look at your site, but they will have scanned the code in advance. And that's another great benefit to open source, is that security can actually happen proactively and it doesn't have to wait until you've custom built something for someone to review it.
My question is, what do you see as next coming down the pipe with federal government needs related to Drupal, and what are you forecasting here for the next year that you'll either be confirming or denying at this time?
So I think there's a few up here that aren't even maybe public. I'm not sure, but some of the larger agencies. I mean, I think look at Department of Energy as an example. Energy.gov is one of 500 so sites maybe, and the National Laboratories even more underneath that department. And they're not picking Drupal because they think it makes that site better. They're picking Drupal because they think that they can roll all those sites onto Drupal. If you do Drupal work, and the idea that the federal government is going to start moving, 500 to 1,000 websites by department over, that's good news, right? I mean, that's a lot of work, but it's a lot of good work. So I think you're going to see more of that. There's some very large agencies and departments, some of the largest that are already starting to signal through their procurement vehicles that they're interested in moving significant amounts of sites, not just one or two, but 500 plus. I think that's going to be the watershed moment.
Jeff, I'm not sure if you're aware of the National Dialogue to Improve Federal Websites, and I'm just wondering, as the government moves forward in terms of trying to consolidate and improve federal websites overall, what do you think Drupal's role in that whole process is going to be?
So the question is, what is the role for Drupal in the National Dialogue to Improve Websites?
Or just the whole effort.
Yeah.
The dialogue is going on right now, and it actually, just to mention that it's just recently been extended to Tuesday, and it's a tremendous opportunity for people to get in and advocate for Drupal adoption. So if anybody's working in the federal government space and believes that that is the case, this dialogue, this online idea-generating dialogue is happening now. And you can submit your ideas and make comments on the use of particular technologies.
Right, and this is Sheila Campbell's thing under GSA.
And it's just been extended.
Yeah. So I mean, I think what like Sheila Campbell is from the GSA, and she runs this thing called the Web Manager Council, and I think what people in federal government that are having to build websites are looking for is basically something that solves a lot of their problems up front. So they want to know how they're going to deal with accessibility, not on a case-by-case basis, but how are they going to have a solution that's going to address accessibility across the board. Language translation, which I know is very near and dear to your heart, so I'll plug that as well. But I think they're looking for a solution that solves a lot of those needs, that's going to come with those things, because the irony is the commercial software vendors haven't exactly put forth sort of a great solution for sort of a government website anyway, which is crazy, but they haven't. So the open source community is rising to that challenge.
Are they considering doing transactions for Drupal? So say paying your parking ticket or
So the question is, are they considering doing like transactional data applications and things like that through Drupal? I think sometimes. I think it depends on what it is. I've seen a lot of examples where those systems tend to be legacy systems, either at state government or national government. They're built on Java or something like that. And those things have a different life cycle and different procurement cycles than the websites themselves. What Drupal's good at is integrating those things into its framework in a way that is seamless. So from a user and role perspective or design perspective, making that feel seamless to the end user. But it's actually not necessarily the best transactional software development tool. It's not Java, right? So if you're going to deal with high volume, transactional data, it's probably not necessarily the best tool. But there are also great examples of it being used for those types of things. So I think it's case by case. It's probably you have to look at it for what it's good for and what it's not.
Yes, did you have to do any customization or tuning for any of these sites that you would consider extraordinary or out of the ordinary for a general business site, either on the back end, caching or anything like that?
So caching is definitely a whole other beast. I mean, certainly Drupal has a lot of open source tools that it integrates with at sort of the database level, the PHP level or sort of Apache level, and beyond. So you can work with things like Akamai or Varnish or things like that can do front end caching. And on high traffic sites like government sites, it's particularly important to have that kind of thing. Particularly to protect against attack as well. In terms of like code customization, I think the dirty secret in Drupal is that everybody is always customizing something, right? The question is, how much do you get out of the box or through the contributed community that you can leverage, you can use the way it is or add on to? I think what people generally do is they customize a lot on the UI. They make things, they theme, they make things look the way they want them to look for custom designs. But a lot of the functionality is kind of tried and true stuff. And government sites today don't tend to be doing massively revolutionary things. I tried to show examples today of things that I think are revolutionary, but a lot of them are serving pretty static content, a lot of multimedia, photo galleries, basic forms, things like that. And those things you can tend to get away with out-of-the-box modules.
I'm wondering, with so many sites on the same platform, if there's much talk about the Semantic Web and pulling all that content together to build more meaning from it.
Yeah, so the question's about the Semantic Web and pulling content together to draw more meaning from it. I'm very sure that Drupal is far ahead of most content, if any content management system I know, in terms of adopting Semantic Web standards. In Drupal 7, we have RDF capability, RDFA, straight out of the box. So that means that content types and taxonomy that you're tagging your content with on the site can be semantically enabled to be both search engines from an RDFA perspective, and then also linkable and starting to get into link data, which is important for government. So I think nobody's doing necessarily the right things with it right now. The best example I would give you is actually a Drupal site. So data.gov is the federal government's sort of clearinghouse for all and catalog for all federal open data. It's not built on Drupal, but the communities aspect where they get developers involved and reach out to developers in a collaborative way is built on Drupal. And if you go there to data.gov, you'll actually see that we have starting to develop a fairly robust catalog of RDF enabled data through open data, through the data.gov portal. So I think that's probably the best example in terms of like doing anything sort of revolutionary in Semantic Web. I think Drupal's great for that. I don't know anyone's cracked that nut yet. So it's probably all the time we have for questions, right? Or do you want to? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.